Oki Nistuni Daniku Aniskamaki. Hello, my name is Latrice Tatsey. My Indian name is Buffalo Stone Woman. I was born and raised on the Blackfeet Nation on my family ranch. My father is Terry Tatsey. My late mother is Cassie Catholiking. I have 3 beautiful children, and as you can see, this is my home and my peace and my serenity. So I always say I'm one of many. On the left there, you could see my buffalo. In the background, you could see my cows and my house. And it just wanted to show you a little bit of who I am in the background that I come from, so you can better understand my story and what I'm about to share with you. And as you can see, I have millions of dogs, and the cats probably somewhere in there are meddling with the buffalo. It's pretty amazing when you see your cat interact with your buffalo. Again, I said I'm from the Blackfeet Reservation in Browning. I currently took a new position as the Natural Resource Conservation Service at the Tribal Conservation District. I'm not in that job position. Are you speaking on that behalf right now? I'm just speaking as an individual and speaking on some work that I did previously. The little blue dot on the map, that is Badger Creek. That is where I was showing you the first photo. The gray dot on the map, that is where I first started doing my research, looking at buffalo restoration, trying to understand what is the relationship of bringing bison back to the land, and what are the ecological processes and the functionalities when you reintroduce bison back onto the landscape. And so historically, you look at numbers and you look at a lot of research, and you'll see that there was 30 to 60 million bison, buffalo. I'll use that term interchangeably. When you think of those numbers, you have to think about it as an economy. We all have an economy. Today, our economy is money. But prior to that, the indigenous economy was their goods and their resources. And so the way I look at it is our economy was rich. We had a nice checking, we had a nice savings, we had a nice ready reserve, and so we were able to sustain ourselves because we had the resources and the availability of resources to do so. And today when we look at it, you know, there's less than 500,000 buffalo and, you know, over 1 million cows. And I'm not pro either one. Like, I love that buffalo. I could always say I kissed a buffalo and I liked it, you know, like as an inside joke. On the left there, it's me and my cousin. We raised a pet cow. Her name was Norman. I was in a stockyard like this. I cried to my mom. I was like, Mom, please buy me that baby calf. And I still remember it had a wet umbilical cord. And we brought it home and we kicked it out of the trailer, and my mom was like, Cassie, what are you doing letting Latrice buy that calf? That calf is gonna die. Like, you just wasted some of our money. And I was like, no, Dad, no, you know, just a kid. And that cow lived, oh my gosh, like until I was in college. And me and my grandma would always have this race. And so she was always like, let's see who has the bigger calves. Mind you, my grandma had over 200 head, and I was just working on my small herd, and I'm like, all right, Norman, we're gonna do this. So I'd like give Norman extra grain every, you know, I'm like, you're gonna have a big healthy baby. And so I'd be like, Grandma, I won. And it was never a prize. It was never anything other than a bragging, right? Like, yeah, Grandma has all these cows, but Norman, yeah, she had the heaviest calf. And so I talk about that because it's important to understand cultural value in relationships to these animals, because a lot of the times they get put against one another. And for me, that's really not fair because they're culturally important to different people. And so when you pit them against that, you're almost taking away the importance of different cultural backgrounds. And so today we look on tribal lands. There's just over 15,000 buffalo on tribal land. And for the herd on the Amskapi Piikani Nation, where I'm from, we have 2 herds. We have the harvest herd, which is kind of managed more like, not like cattle, but more so where they handle the animals more, and they call those animals more for meat products to get them introduced in the local market system, the casinos, and they do have their own jerky system. And then they have the conservation herd, which they call the wild herd, and you guys, if any of you watch Bring Them Home, it was about the return of, of these animals. And so it talks about in this story how in that conservation herd, these calves were captured, brought to Canada, and then they were returned to their ancestral lands. And so for me, that's really important, because when I go out on the land, this is me when I worked with my interns in my previous position when I worked for Pecunny Lodge Health Institute. We would go out with the buffalo management team, and we would ask them, when are you guys moving? Can we come help? Because I wanted my interns to see what the relationship was. And what they got to see is when the lead cow was ready to move, she was walking that fence line, back and forth, walking that fence line, because she knew it was time to move to the next pasture. And so these buffalo were going in between cattle herds and in different fences. But knowing that corridor and going that corridor for the past 10 years, these older cows were teaching these younger calves on where to go and where their territories are. And you could see it in the fall too, when those cows start to get antsy. They know it's time to go back to their wintering ground. And so, the interns got to see that. They got to experience that. And so it's always important to include youth on bringing them out to the land, because when you look at the age of agricultural producers, they're over in their 50s. And we need to realize that we need to get youth in agriculture to sustain it. And so for me, that's what I always do. I always make sure I give youth that experience. And so what we do is I take them out and we look at drive lines, we look at buffalo jumps. And why is this important? It's important because I want to show them what the different types of management that was out on the land. And so what you're looking at is a buffalo jump out by my house. So you have the Badger Creek water tributary. The larger oval circles represent the camping site. So you'll see all the different teepee rings in these areas. The yellow lines, those represent where their different rock cairns are placed. And these are those tall rocks in which they would place to help kind of bring the buffalo in. And where the circle dot is, that's where the rock cairns come in narrow and narrower. And so you think about that. You think about that type of management, understanding the diversity of the landscape. If you could look here, you can also tell a glacier went through this area. It looks like a comb scraped through that. And so you see the landscape and you see how they utilize those different coulees and those different topography to run those animals in. And so it's really neat to see this. And this jump was in the afternoon, around noon. So if you can imagine running off a large cliff with the sun coming at you high noon, that's what was going on at this site. And so what I have here is I have my oldest daughter. She is not that small now. She's 16 and towers over me. She's about 6 foot now. And so this is what I did with her. What my dad did with me is put her on back of a horse, as young as she could, and showing her these sites, even though she didn't know what we were looking at. I would bring her around, and so when I was doing my research, I had my dad go out, and I was like, Dad, I need some pictures of where this buffalo jump is, because I'm talking about nutrient inputs from buffalo jumps and kind of what impacts aren't there no more, and kind of changes that are gonna, that have been happening to plant communities because you don't have those type of nutrient inputs in there anymore. I said, so I want to talk about, how that influences the soil. And so that's another tangent, but that, that is the importance of this buffalo jump, because when you look at the land, you can learn so much from the land. And so when you look at the return of the return of buffalo, you look at cultural healing. And what does that mean? It means relearning your identity as a person, because you have these animals that were removed from you, removed from a part of your culture. And when you have them brought back, it brings a sense of healing. I can remember, being out on the landscape with my dad, bouncing around on the back of a horse when I was my daughter's age, learning my colors and how to spell my name and all these things, because I cried because I didn't want to go to preschool. And so understanding that firsthand education and learning that, what we were looking at was past tense, but looking at how we can make it present day. And so now my kids get to go out where I was looking at buffalo jumps, and now they get to see our 2 little buffalo out there grazing with our cows. And when we have INE days, the youth get to harvest and take apart a buffalo, and they get to have that piece and say, like, this is what I've done. Like, I've handled this animal and the ceremony that goes with it, because we just don't take the buffalo. We honor the animal's life, so it's a part of that cultural healing. And how is it tied to the ecological importances? Well, bison, buffalo, they're keystone species. And so how they influence landscapes is pretty beautiful and powerful and impactful, the way I look at it. And when I'm looking at these ways and how they utilize the landscape, for me, it's relearning. Because in our cultural ways, the animals always taught the people, and it was the people who were to take those teachings and move them forward. And so when we tie into those ecological importances into soil health, what I like to say is when we look at a system, when we look at an ecological system, a lot of the times we're looking at it from the top up. But when I look at an ecological system, I think about it from the bottom up, because I think about the soil health, the microbial communities. I think about the root systems. I think about the plant communities, and how are those plant communities influencing the health of the animals, and how healthy are your animals, because the healthier animals is going to influence the healthier operation, and the healthier operation is going to influence the economics of your outcome and of your operation. And so for me, that's all intertwined. And when I look at this, I also look at the diversity, because it also represents this medicine wheel. If we take out the words in that, it also represents the background of people, because we are all one in this world. No matter if we look different, we're all one. And when we come together as people and we share ideas and systems and are creative, we become really amazing problem solvers. And so I always like to keep that in mind, because we are all native to somewhere. And so what are those relationships? And so I like to talk about the importance of Inuit to land. We talk about, their keystone, being a keystone species, and their critical role, and how they grazed, and how it impacted plant communities. Because for some plants, when that saliva hits, those plants just grow and grow. When they urinate on them, it does amazing things for those plants. And so you think about that evolutionary relationship that they've had, and our people say since time immemorial. And any in the land, like, they are native to North America. When they forage, they disperse seeds. It aids in plant growth. Their hooves aerate the soil, same as cattle in a lot of aspects. And then in the buffalo, they wallow. That's really important, because what I was learning when I brought my buffalo in, where I hadn't seen wallowing in the little pastures where they were kept, I was seeing that, and I was seeing more greenery in those from that impact. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're increasing the water holding capacity in these areas. So I was learning so much while I was thinking, oh, well, how am I going to manage them? They were teaching me how to manage them. And so this is how big they were when I got them. They were the same age as when I kissed that little buffalo. And they're from the same herd that I did my research on. And so, everything in Indian country, our Indian culture, is full circle. And that's what I thought about. I was researching these animals, and I got gifted these buffalo. And it was one of the biggest blessings, because I always wanted to bring buffalo back to our operation, because I see the teepee rings, I see the buffalo jumps, I know the history of our land. And so to bring them back, it was really emotional for me. I was like full on baby crying, like, my kids are like, oh my God, Mom has boogers coming out of her nose. Like, get it together. Like, they're just buffalo, Mom, but for me, it was just more than that, because, my kids get to see it at a younger age. And when they go run out, I'm like, kids, now you're like our ancestors. You're running the buffalo off the hills, like, this is something that hasn't happened in this area for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so 2 years ago was the first time I let my buffalo out with my cows. And everybody on the ranch thought I was crazy. They're like, the disease, the this, the that. And I was like, okay, well, I'll see. I'm a scientist. I like science, trial by error. If you don't mess up, you don't learn nothing. Then you just become arrogant. That's what science is about. And so for me, that was really, I really learned a lot about that. And so they first got out, the first time they got out, I was like, where are they at? And I seen this little beef calf, kind of like, when you see buffalo, calves, they kind of bounce, and buffalo do that. Well, a beef calf was doing that, and I was like, what's going on, And I was just like, I just had this feeling to go up in this coulee, and sure enough, my buffalo were up there, and I was like, oh, is this a transfer of knowledge? Are they, sharing stuff with the cows to teach the cows how to aerate the soil? And my kids are all like eye rolling me, like, whatever, Mom. But it was, those importances. And so then when I talk about, relationship-based management, well, what does that look like? And for me, and it includes like the inclusion of others' ideas and backgrounds, and understanding where people are in their operations, and listening to people and hearing all the hard things, because it's when you go in my work now as an NRCS employee, when you work with tribal producers, it's really hard to have them open up when you are trying to offer them services, because there's a mistrust in the government. And so when I look at relationship-based management, I look at how am I going to approach my producer, and no matter what background they come from, and no matter how hard it is for them to share, because I notice if I hear their hard stuff first, it's easier for me to help them. And the reason I share that is because I take interns out, and we call it integrating cultural science ways into our ways of doing, because it's identifying who we are as people, so it helps us better serve our community. And that's really what it is. And so this is us just going out in the field, taking soil samples, and understanding how the soil breathes, looking at soil respiration, trying to understand what is the biological, chemical, and the physical properties of this. What are the cultural values that are tied when we're looking at soil respiration, when we're looking at carbon, and when we're looking at different grazing habitats, our grazing management practices. And what we do is we go back and we utilize cultural relationships and look at old teepee rings. And why is that important? Well, we're looking at those teepee rings to see how people lived off the land, but also looking at how does this help us come up and be creative and innovative in some ideas that we want to put on the landscape. And so what we did is we start building snow fences, and what I had the interns do is I had them come up with all recyclable material. And so their first assignment was like, put this in our language. And so they did, and so we would share this. And so what they did is they built this on my ranch, and we had to get creative because we didn't have funding. I'm like, we're going to use everything we can here that's recyclable. And so we did. They weaved this snow fence, and they put a lot of the direction was based on the teepee ring, the measurements around the teepee ring. And that's how we were integrating cultural science. And so when we go out and talk with producers and talk about relationships, we're also integrating our cultural values into our systems, because we understand how our relationships are to land, and to make sure we make those cultural connections, because we have to put that responsibility back on ourselves, that stewardship responsibility. And so with this, I leave you with this quote. Estebactibio Creator made all living things equal. Humans were not given the right to rule over or exploit the rest of nature. Things have been changed in our culture, but the core values are still important to us. Our ceremonies continue to affirm our connection with all the natural world. So this was from our elders up in Canada and the United States. So I thought I always end with this slide because it shows us that we are inherently all a part of nature. So thank you.
Latrice, thank you so much. Good jokes also. Really appreciate that. All right, we definitely have time for some questions. So, yeah, see who has a question for Latrice. Oh, there's two up there. All right, we'll bring two microphones up.
Oh, careful, girl.
I fell.
I about did that earlier too.
Hi, thank you. I'm interested, you talked about the impact that the buffalo jumps have on the nutrients in that area. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that.
So when I was looking into it, when you have harvest sites, you have potassium, phosphorus, calcium. And if you look at in these studies in Africa, you look at when they move the wildebeest and the nutrient impacts to that river. And so I was looking at that data and I was thinking, after people would harvest, they would have all these nutrient deposits in there, and then they would burn after that they would harvest in those kill sites. And so for me, it was really about those plant communities and what has changed in those microbial communities, because you no longer have those soil nutrient inputs, you no longer have those sugars and those carbohydrates being inputted. So for me, I was always curious of what changes have happened in those areas since there's no longer that type of management practice being done, so.
I was curious if you could speak to that experiment of putting the buffalo with the cattle. I wasn't clear on how long they've been running together, but what other observations have you seen, and did you have any expectations?
So I've seen a lot. So I noticed when we get our buffalo in with the cows and we, do the spring health check, that the buffalo just take them right out. And they're like, we're not coming back until, we need to. And as soon as it's really, really cold and the storms come through, like I see my buffalo bringing the cows back down. And I'm like, are you just doing this because I'm going to grain you girls? And then, we're going to throw some hay to the cows, but you guys are going to get hay and grain. But those are the different things that I see is like, when it gets really frigidly cold, the buffalo bringing the cows off the hills. And I'm like, okay, that's new for me. So for me, it's always about the learning. And I thought I was really smart, and I was like, I'm going to teach my buffalo, about an electric fence. So I built this paddock, it was really tall, and I put my buffalo in there, and they like touched it with their nose, and they looked like little ping pong balls. And mind you, it was down in the trees by the cottonwoods. And there was some stumps there, and like lo and behold, did I think that the buffalo were gonna be like, oh, let's jump on these stumps and jump over the fence and get into the creek? I did not. So it taught me that, no matter how smart I think I am, like they will always teach me like how to be humble and humble me down.
Thank you. My question for you was, how has your personal experience, coupled with maybe any information that's been passed down over the ages, helped shape your perspective as a now technical service provider with the NRCS?
Can I have you repeat the question, please?
How has your personal experience with the buffalo and any information passed down through the generations helped shape your perspective and, I guess, experience as a TA provider with the NRCS?
Just, I guess, the relationship to the land has helped shape me in looking at the relationships, if that's what you're asking, in the upbringing, because my dad, at one time, he was the manager of the tribal buffalo herd, and he took care of them. And I remember seeing him, in the morning take care of our cows, and then in the earlier afternoon, like take care of the buffalo. And I was always like, that is so cool. And he would share those stories, and he would tell me like the pet buffalo's name that they had. I think his name was Bob. And he was like, Bob's always in trouble. He gets too playful and almost hurts people. And I was like, I want a playful buffalo. And so I think that that experience and upbringing, and I also didn't say that since I was 9 years old, like my dad took me hunting in the mountains. And after my mom passed away, my dad didn't know how to do holidays, so I would spend like Christmas and Thanksgiving up in the mountains, and that's where I first seen people taking water samples out of the creek, and I was like, Dad, what are they doing? And I was like 10, 11. He was like, they're taking water samples out of the North and South Fork of Badger. He's like, but I already tell you, this is, the cleanest watershed that we have. And so for me, my upbringing, knowing where the North and South Fork of Badger come, because that flows right in front of my house, knowing where the water starts that I'm drinking from, knowing that the land I live on is still our traditional territories, having that still inherently in my upbringing has really helped shape who I am today and the research that I do. If, did you also have a soil health aspect of that too? Oh, okay.
We have one over here.
Hi, my name is Ryan Stanley. I'm from the Navajo Reservation. And I was just curious about the buffaloes, that saying you had a reconnection with them. And I'm kind of guessing, or not assuming, but that you have a story about buffaloes and the idea of the creation story. And then my second question is some people, or Western science kind of often forgets about cultural science for indigenous people. How can we improve that in a modern setting like this?
Okay, so I'll start with the cultural science question first, because I love cultural science. I think when we're looking into cultural science, we have to understand there's different perspectives. And when I look at cultural science, the way that I view it is it's how we survived and sustained ourselves. The cultural science that we know is how we've evolved. Our knowledge of the plants come from the stories of our elders and from the medicines of our elders. And in Native culture, everything's passed down through stories. And so even when I was researching the Blackfeet calendar stick, it was really hard to get that information because I was like, it's not in a book. So I had to go sit down with elders and hear the creation stories and hear ceremony stories that was tied to the calendar stick. And the more I started to research it, I realized that the Mayans had a calendar stick too. And so then I realized at some point, our people were traveling to these other areas to learn these other cultures. And so it was really fascinating for me to see how our cultures are tied to that, because the calendar stick is tied to the lunar moons. And so and this is a whole nother subject, but for me, that was my first taste of learning what cultural science is, because at that time I was learning about a weather station and taking the data from that and uploading it. And I was like, damn, we had, sorry kids, I was like, oh man, we had, our own kind of meteorologist stick, because, when it was winter, that the shadow on that calendar stick was really long because of where our position was around the sun, versus in the summer, the shadow was really short. And so that's when I start really delving into cultural science and understanding that in order to really understand it, I had to go back to hear these stories. And a lot of those stories were tied to our creation stories and who we are as people. And so innately, the knowledge base for cultural science is tied to our stories. And what was the second part of your question? Did I answer both parts of your question? So the way that I was able to implement it was, I don't have it on this slide yet. Well, I did, but it was where everybody was, on one side was the buffalo pasture, the other side was the cattle pasture, and I had this circular formation around it. And so I was using the circle, and I had my soil respiration circles, and we would do the infiltration rates and look at the respiration after. And so for me, it was utilizing that circular model, looking at putting tobacco down when I was going out to these sites, and looking at when we were looking at clay pans and different things, realizing we couldn't share all the materials because our people use that clay pan for prenatals and stuff. So there's a lot of that knowledge that was tied to it. So for me, it's finding that basis of what you're trying to get across. And Western science is very abiotic and biotic. In indigenous science, cultural science, we see everything as living. And so in those regards, it's really hard to find the similarities. But when you're working with cultural science, as long as you're working with what your knowledge base is for your tribes, then it's a lot easier, because you have to identify what those resources are. And a lot of your cultural science is tied to your stories.
I have one question from folks online, and then we will wrap up. So the question is, just recently learned about the Indigenous Animals Harvesting and Meat Processing Grant Program. I was wondering if you have participated in this program and what your thoughts are. Is this a successful program that should continue?
I have not participated in this program, but I think for food sustainability and for food sovereignty, that, you know, when you're able to process your own foods and grow your own foods, it allows you that freedom and it gives you that ability to know exactly what you're eating and where it come from. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but we, the Blackfeet Nation has just got a mobile slaughtering unit, and so what they're gonna start doing is processing a lot of that meat and doing training for people in the community. So I think, you know, those moves in Indian country and other, you know, rural areas are really important because we do have those food disparities.
I'm guessing that that was a really solid answer. Everybody, big round of applause for Latrice. And Latrice, thank you so much for joining us.